Hello everyone, this is Paul Stephan, and today I'm going to be talking about a few different bonsai pots and the artists and their history. Now, the reason I'm doing this is I want to spread more information about these artists so we could have higher quality bonsai pots in our shows. Here in Los Angeles, I don't really see I see a lot of maybe Tokoname production ware, but I don't see higher quality bonsai pots. And why is it important to have higher quality pots? It really could amplify your tree's beauty. In the end, bonsai is a composition between the tree and the pot. And as I as I've come to the realization that bonsai it really boils down to history. At least really good bonsai comes down to history, and it's the history of the tree and the history of the pot. Both of those combined can make just spectacular pieces of art. But I think both are very, very important. And so I've seen for sure some improvement in just the quality of bonsai trees, but the quality of pots has remained stagnant. And especially with smaller trees, shohin and mame trees, the container is even more valuable. It really just makes your tree pop, and the history, if you know about it, really makes you appreciate the tree and the pot much more. So today I'm going to talk about Takamoto Masanori. So he's a forerunner of shohin / mame bonsai. So back then they more so had bigger trees, and bonsai wasn't even that popular to begin with back then. It was more of an elitist thing to do, and by back then I mean in like the late 1800s. And Takamoto and another individual called Count Matsudaira, the Count bought a lot of Takamoto's works and put his small trees in pots and shows, and really kind of helped develop the popularity of Takamoto and his little teeny tiny beautiful pots. And with that popularity, there was a higher demand for these development of mame trees. So it's kind of a fascinating little history. But Takamoto, let's talk about him a little. He was born in 1848, and this was right before the Meiji Restoration. There's this American admiral named Commodore Perry. He came to Japan, and like Americans do sometimes, we said, we want to trade with you guys, and you don't really have a choice. So, of course, the shogun, who was the ruler of the time, the emperor was more so a symbol, figurehead. The shogun had to agree because he was coerced. And the people of Japan really did not like this, especially the Satsuma samurai and Choshu samurai of the south. And so there was eventually an uprising, and these samurai, the Shishi samurai, they actually took up arms, modern arms. So they had pistols and rifles, and they stormed the shogun's castle, and there was a big battle that happened, and they basically overthrew the shogun. And so it's kind of ironic because after they overthrew the shogun, the samurai elites, they started to draft up a new government, and they put in place the emperor as their leader, Meiji. He was like a boy at the time. And it really was, they ended up removing the samurai class. And so, of course, a lot of samurai, since they were fighting these battles, didn't want this. That was their employment. That was their living. That was their status. But but they abolished the samurai class, and that caused a second uprising of samurai, and that was the last stand of the samurai, basically. So they fought against the government, which were also samurai, and it was basically samurai versus samurai, but the government already weaponized the peasants and whatnot, and they destroyed the samurai uprising. It did not succeed with the new modernized army. And so this is the reason I went on this long tangent is because Takamoto and his father were in the samurai class. Takamoto's father was a very high-ranking samurai, and he directly served the shogun of the time. And so when the shogun got dethroned, it was very life-changing for Takamoto and his father. And as a samurai, your employment is usually to serve the shogun, or you acted as a mercenary if you were a ronin. But that wasn't really common at the time. It was more of they didn't really take up arms during that time very commonly. Oops. And but basically they lost employment. And so Takamoto, impoverished, he moved to an area around Tokyo. And at the time he had a fascination for pottery. And he met a potter called Ryosai, and this man, who eventually became famous, but he wasn't at the time, encouraged Takamoto to make more pots, and together they actually ended up starting a kiln. This was an ware-style kiln, which is basically like an old-fashioned kiln, and all these kilns were wood-fired, so that's why they really had to collaborate. Firing alone isn't really practical. It takes up a lot of wood. It's usually done for days. So normally you have to fire a lot of pieces to make it worthwhile. So together they took up pottery, and they made some absolutely fabulous pots. During the time of this new government, there was an adoption of Western technology, Japanese spirit, and so why I mention that is Takamoto took up a Western technique of making molds. You could actually see the dimples on the bottom of the pot, and the pot itself is perfect, like a lot of his pots. Not all of his pots are mold made, but a lot of them are. The feet, you could see, are just, they're so alike, and they're not really, there's no mark for where they were slipped on, because it's all one piece, because it was pressed into a mold. But it doesn't, normally I don't like molds, but in this case, the age, the patina, the history really outweighs that it was made by a mold. And the glaze, it's a celadon glaze with beautiful age to it. It's just a really, really nice pot. But he did make other handmade pieces for more higher end customers, more a niche market. But that market wasn't very developed, so it wasn't nearly as common as his. I guess you would call this his production ware. But unfortunately, he died kind of young in 1892 due to stomach cancer, but dying young wasn't that uncommon at the time, but it was still unfortunate since he became a pretty popular artist with the help of Count Matsudaira, who was a philanthropic aristocrat who bought tons of Takamoto's pots. So I'm actually going to show you guys another pot. It looks like you got a pretty good look at this one probably, since I was ranting for a while. So here's another one. You could also see that this was made by a mold. The feet are perfect. The shape of the pot is perfect. And let's see, and this is a semi-porcelain. Okay, now we are moving on to Takamoto. Yeah, we're moving on from Takamoto to Heian Tofukuji. Tofukuji's he's a famous artist from Japan, and he's very sought after. It's kind of unfortunate because during his lifetime his works were not nearly as popular. There was a boom in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, around that time when Japan's economy really was taking off, and there was a lot of wealth that could go to the arts. Kind of like in the Renaissance of Italy, there was a lot of wealth, like the Medici families. And so it went to one art was being bonsai, and bonsai pottery. A lot of money went into it, and so these pots, they emerged and were highly sought after, very expensive. They're still expensive today. That's why I only have a small one, because I am not going to be buying a big one anytime soon. But anyway, Tofukuji lived a lot of his life in poverty. He collaborated with some artists because he didn't have enough money to fire in his own kiln. So he would kind of share a kiln with some of his artist friends. I believe Eno, he fired with him a few times, but yeah, he really grew up in poverty, pre-war, and I think post-war he was probably a little bit better off, but he did live through World War I and II, so that's how old he is. He was born in the early 1890s, I think it was 1891. So he was kind of born towards the time when Takamoto died in the late 1800s. So here's an example of his work. Glazed piece with that greenish blue glaze, which I love green blue glazes. You're gonna probably you're gonna see that soon as you see more of my pots. I love that. It really goes well with the tree. Green and blue both mix really well with the green foliage. This appears to be block carved, and that is when they just take a big unit of clay and they excavate out the shape of a pot. It creates a really strong it creates strong integrity in the piece, but it's pretty time consuming, so most artists don't really do that. They usually slab build a lot of their works, or they make them on the wheel if they're round. But this one appears to be block carved, which is pretty unique. Something that I look for usually is I like nice lips. This one doesn't have a lip, or it doesn't have the little extension off of the rim of the pot, but it's still, I think it complements the pot, and I still like the style that it was made in. Feet are another thing to look for. These are just simple little feet, but this really has that characteristic wonderful glaze that Tofukuji has. A lot of modern artists still try to replicate his glazes. For example, Bushwan is also known as like the reincarnation of Tofukuji. He tries to replicate these Noborigama fired pieces, and what that is, the Noborigama kiln, is the climbing kiln. It's a type of wood firing technique. They don't really do it anymore because it's costly, it's time consuming, it makes a lot of pollution, so they now use, most people use electric kilns. In the United States, there actually are some people who are adopting this wood-fired kiln because it creates such beautiful pieces, but it's really an archaic practice and it's generally not used. But once again, Tofukuji is just, not only are his bowls, his bonsai pots very usable usually. He has some pretty nicely sized pieces. Not all of them are small. but they could also just be appreciated on their own for their immense beauty. I kind of like how the glaze on the bottom of this one just kind of slipped out there. It's a nice little addition. But you could see the clay is really grainy. So sometimes he had to cut his clay because he didn't have enough money to just buy it, I guess. He really had to improvise, which is kind of what brings such variability to his pots. But I hope you liked this little preview of Tofukuji. I'll eventually be probably getting into more detail with these artists, but I kind of want to breeze through a few different types of pots. So here's another little mame rectangle. This was made by Heian Koso, and he's another Kyoto-based, once again, the Heian, Kyoto-based potter. He collaborated with a lot of artists from the Kyoto region. He actually had a bonsai nursery, which was kind of a hybrid of it had a nursery and a kiln. So he was able to bring in artists, and they kind of discussed pottery techniques and maybe glaze formulas. Some of the artists that I can name off that he interacted with was Eiso Wakamatsu, who's known for really small, oftentimes block carved pieces. Heian Koso, nicknamed the Razor, for making his perfect pots. It's amazing how clean his pots are. There's usually wonk to a lot of handmade pieces, but his pieces rarely have that wonk. They're just cleanly cut, really strong lines. And of course, Tofukuji, another Kyoto-based potter. I really love Kyoto for pottery. It just creates, the glazes seem to be a little better than a lot of different regions. A very popular region is the Tokoname region. I personally don't really like many potters from that region. It focuses more so on production ware. A lot of names that you may have heard of from the Tokoname region are like the Yamaki kiln, the Koyo kiln, Yozan, Shuho, and their pots are nice. It's a good bang for your buck, but if you really want a historical piece it transcends a little bit above just production, then I don't really look for the Tokoname artists for those kind of works. Now, that does not mean that all Tokoname artists are inferior, because they do make some wonderful pieces. For example, Nankano, or the Gyozan kiln, and Iko, Iko does some production, but he also does some beautiful pieces when he's not doing production. And Nankano or the Gyozan kiln has made some production, but they also do very nice handmade pieces, and those pots are pretty spectacular. But in general, every region has its own kind of style, and the Tokoname in general is more so, it leans towards production ware. So that's something to keep in mind if you're looking for a really high quality pot. I more so look to the Kyoto region. You guys know, I love Kyoto-based potters. But okay, so I didn't really talk too much about Heian Koso, but he with this nursery, he really helped to popularize bonsai pottery. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next pot. I'm going back to the Kyoto region. So sometimes when you buy an individual artist, for example, Tofukuji or Kozan or Eiso Wakamatsu. All these pots are, because they have a name behind them, they're generally very expensive. But if you want an aged pot and you want that history of the region of Kyoto and you want a beautiful pot, but you don't want to buy really the name, something I recommend is the Kyo-Yaki ware. Kyo-Yaki is basically antique Kyoto-based pottery, bonsai pots, or not only bonsai pots, but in this case bonsai pots. And they were made from the Meiji era to the early Showa era, so like late 1800s to early 1900s. And this glaze in particular on this piece is really characteristic of the Kyo-Yaki, and it has that cinnabar or the shinsha glaze. This one is really complex. I'll show you another one in a moment that's not nearly as nice as this one, but you could see that these were wood fired. That's why. And yeah, so the glaze, so this doesn't really have a name. This one does have a kiln stamp, or a chop as they call it, but I'm not familiar with where that comes from, and I don't think, even if you asked a professional, I don't think they would be familiar. It looks kind of like a lightning bolt. Okay, but this one has a really complex glaze to it, nice age, and that really grainy clay. Really like this one. But this glaze is very characteristic, and not nearly as expensive as those named pots, but you still get that Kyoto-based beauty, and you get the age. So here is another Kyo-Yaki. You could see it has that similar cinnabar glaze, very old. This one's even, this one appears to be a little older than that last one. The patina on it, that dripping glaze, bottoms, looks like it went through hell in that kiln. But yeah, that's another Kyo-Yaki. And let's look at another. This one's a little bit more vibrant. A taller rectangle, so this would be good for like a semi-cascade of some sort, or just a chunky little tree. And the cool color to the clay, but that characteristic glaze once again. See, it looks pretty old on the bottom, and the glaze appeared to drip all the way down onto the shelf. They had to shave that off, it looks like. Alright, let's see another. Here's another Kyo-Yaki. So this is, it doesn't have that traditional, that glaze I showed like the other three, but it does have the characteristic shape. Now a lot of these don't have chops. The vast majority do not have chops, and the chop is the kiln stamp. So let me flip that around. But as you get a little bit more experienced looking at bonsai pots, you'll find the chops are not nearly as reliable as almost as just looking at the pot. You'll see a lot of characteristic forms, kind of like those little windows carved into the pot. And also just artists in particular, they usually have a very characteristic feature that they include on their pots or form. And over time, I find it gets much easier to identify pots when you look more so at the form, not just at the kiln stamp or the chop. So, but this is a characteristic pot from that area. Very nice. I think there's even a little fingerprint in there. I don't know if you guys can see that. But once again, it's that greenish blue glaze that I really enjoy. Okay. Okay, so this has been taking a little bit longer than I anticipated. So I'll have a part 2 to this where I talk about a few more artists, but you guys saw a lot of Kyoto-based potters. So we went over Tofukuji, we went over Heian Koso and these Kyo-Yakis. Takamoto isn't Kyoto-based, but he is a really influential potter, especially if we're going to look at mame bonsai pots. We have to look at his first because he's just, without him, it really would not have been developed. But I hope you enjoyed a little bit of my ranting on bonsai pots. I realize no one really talks about bonsai pots, and if they do, they charge money. So I'm trying to get people more involved in the information, and I figure that the more that people know, the more people will enjoy it, the more of a demand there will be for these bonsai pots because they'll want to feature their trees in these pots. So I think educating and spreading knowledge on the mame/shohin pots or just all sorts of pots will be really beneficial to everyone. Feel free to comment and kind of critique how I made these videos. This is kind of free form, just whatever thoughts I have I'm throwing out there, and if you have any ideas on how I should change how I present, let me know. I always like hearing feedback so I can improve upon my video. But thank you for listening, and if you liked the video, it does take me a really long time to make these because you have to edit it and I talk forever, so that in itself takes a long time. But and if you're curious, look at my website, keybonsaiart.com, and I'm slowly going to put more information on there. I do have some bonsai pots for sale and some information, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll have more in the future. We'll talk about more artists soon. Thank you. Bye.